Okay, we'll get started here on our next session. Just so you know, I know there's been some confusion, but this is specifically for foreign schools. So if you are from a domestic school, actually this is a very different process. So I don't mean to rain on your parade, but we probably won't be covering the information that will be pertinent to you. And actually the top audit compliance findings for domestic schools are a little bit different than foreign schools. So we'll wait just another minute here. Do we have any new folks in here that weren't in here the last session? So I need to introduce myself, basically. You remember me? Okay. I'm Andy Hagedorn. I work for the Foreign Schools team at the department. I'm in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to cover the top audit compliance findings and how to avoid repeat findings. Unfortunately, Marcia is not feeling well, so she will not be joining me today. But we will go ahead and move forward and do the best we can. So this is what we're going to cover kind of in a high level. So as what the top findings were. We had this as the top 10, but I kind of consolidated a couple of them. So we'll talk about how you're going to resolve those, the audit rejection letters, some tips for a successful compliance audit, and a few resources for you. So I kind of want to start at a high level and talk about, well, do we have some folks that are new here? Don't even know what a compliance audit really means? Yeah, okay. So when you participate in the direct loan program, as soon as you start drawing down funds, then you're going to be required to do a compliance audit, okay? And the compliance audits are annual, and they cover your prior fiscal year for your school, which could be different for each of you. And the audit is due 6 months after the date of the end of your fiscal year. So there are two types of audits that we currently do. One is the standard compliant audit. That's for schools that have $500,000 or more in loan volume. And then we have an alternative compliance engagement, which is for less than $500,000. So as you all saw, I think most of you saw yesterday, we talked about a new audit guide coming out eventually. So that's in the works, but until we get that, I wanted to make a note of what the current audit guide says. So this is very important for you. The Foreign School Audit Guide has not been updated since 2002 and does not reflect the changes to regulations and guidance that have been made since that time. An independent public accountant performing an audit on a foreign institution must be familiar with the current regulations and guidance applicable to foreign institutions and must audit the foreign institution for compliance with those current requirements. So that means when you talk to your auditor and they say, well, this guide is from 2002, you can say, yes, but I'm paying you a lot of money and you have to know the current regulations. Okay, so make sure you have a good auditor. So these are the almost top 10. They're very common in the domestic world, so there's only a certain number of mistakes you can actually make in financial aid. And these are the most common ones, not always by loan volume, but this is certainly by the number of errors that we see being reported. So the top one is the NSLDS roster reporting, which is the National Student Loan Data System. Okay. And I know yesterday we went over some of that. You saw this presentation about NSLDS, and so some of you might have been intimidated by all the screens and numbers, but it's not too bad once you get in there. But we'll talk about that a little bit. Entrance and exit counseling deficiencies. Whenever a student borrows loans, then they have to complete these. So this is the rights and responsibilities of their borrowing. Student credit balance deficiencies. Repeat findings, things that we see more than 1 year in a row, which means that you were trying to take some sort of corrective action, but it didn't work. And then an incorrect calculation of what we call the EFC or the COA. So the EFC is the expected family contribution, and the COA is the cost of attendance. And then continuing on down the list, we have an enrollment status that was not verified before disbursement, attendance records that are missing, or your policy is inadequate, a lack of administrative capability, and the borrower was not notified timely about the right to cancel their loans. So let's talk a little bit about NSLDS. So NSLDS used to be a form in there called the system in there was called the SSCR, the Student Status Confirmation Report. And so every few years, just to confuse you, we actually create new names and acronyms. And so now we have one called the NSLDS, enrollment reporting. So there's no more SSCRs. You don't have to worry about remembering that one anymore. So it's important, though, that you pay attention to this. These are common, and I guess the takeaway from this is what is the outcome for the student when you do these incorrectly, right? So this is why we talk about these, because everything that is on here impacts the student in some way, okay? So it either means that they could be under-awarded, they could be over-awarded, their interest rate calculation could be wrong on their student loans. They could be paying more interest because you made your mistake. They become less interest, which they would love you for. But there are all sorts of things that impact the student when we talk about these types of situations. Policies, those all have impacts on our students. So the NSLDS enrollment roster, you saw yesterday, again, we talked about that. You're trying to figure out whether students are, we have to update whether they're enrolled in your institution, whether they withdrew, what their status is, if they're less than half time. And there's also the program level enrollment. And as you heard this morning, I think some of you probably went to the keynote speech right after Cynthia Hammond was talking about this. So this, again, has an impact for the student if we don't properly discuss program level. And this can impact the amount of student loans that students can get, since we don't have grants to deal with, but these are all things that are part of that. It also impacts subsidized loans, too, how long they can get their sub-loans. And also when students are going to start repaying their loans. So do you know how long they have, once they go into the grace period, how long they have to repay? When does the grace period, how long is the grace period? 6 months. How many times can they get that? One time. What if they go 5 months and 29 days? Can they get another one? If they re-enroll? Yes. Not very common, though. So you have to report these changes to enrollment, okay? So here, just some specific dates, because we like to confuse people on dates. But the NSLDS sends a roster electronically to your school or your servicer every 60 days, or more frequently if you schedule it. Usually it's every 60 days. And then you're required to update this. So you have to certify the information within how many days? Do you remember? 15. Good. All right. And so what happens, though, if something changes in the student? Let's say you get your roster on the 60th day and you're waiting 2 more months, but a student withdraws. When should you do that? You should do it immediately. That's a good answer, yes. How long do you have? Do you remember? You have 30 days to make that change. So there's a problem there. You see that? You're getting your roster every 60 days, but you got to make a change before that. Now you see how you get these bindings? We trick you. So you have to be really careful. You have to be really careful of the deadlines. Yeah. So this is why you have an auditor that you pay. You want to make sure they find these things and help you in future years. That's what our job is. And where would I go to find more information about this? What's the Financial Aid Bible called? The Federal Student Aid Handbook. Correct. Yes, that's where a lot of the answers are. There's more information for NSLDS. There's a whole book on NSLDS. What's the name of the book? Do you remember? The Enrollment Guide. NSLDS Enrollment Guide. That's a big, long, thick document with lots of terminology in it, but again, will help you. So. Entrance and exit counseling. So back in the old days, when I was working, we used to do all this in person and on paper. So now that we're thrust into the next century, things are a little more exciting and easier because we can do it online. Where do you go to do it online? Where does it send you students? Studentloans.gov. Okay, so they can log in and they can do entrance and exit counseling here. And you can learn everything you wanted to know about entrance and exit counseling in Volume 2, Chapter 6, page 2-170 of the Federal Student Aid Handbook. Okay, that's where it's all at. That's where you go and find this information. Question?
I've got a question about exit counselling.
Okay.
If we ask the students to do exit counselling because they're completing their studies with us, is it an acceptable argument on their part to say, I'm enrolling at a different institution, so I don't need to do it, or should we insistently do it?
Yeah, so the question is about exit counseling. I'll cover that actually, and we'll talk about that in a second, but in more detail. But no, the student is required to do it. So you have to prove that you at least gave them the information. Okay, but it's by institution. It's not everywhere. So. So for entrance counseling, you do this before you do a disbursement to a first-time, usually first-year borrower, right? Okay. And you can get your proof in studentloans.gov. This is the stuff that you give your auditor, right? And also for you, and you can check the students. And so if you get a student that comes in and argues with you and they don't have it on there, no money. See, so you can withhold these disbursements until you get everything you need. Otherwise, you're out of compliance. So the fact that the student came in with $50 and they're desperate for money doesn't mean that you have to make a disbursement if they didn't complete the process correctly. So when you are, first of all, what is entrance counseling? I'm sure some of you are new, may not know. It's the rights and responsibilities of borrowing money. So this is the I promise to repay my loans speech, right? So we have a process where we go through, and it's online now, but I used to do this in person. And we talk about loan repayment options and the consequences of default and all sorts of good things. And then sometimes some schools even do additional counseling. You can do more than one, right? You can never have enough counseling. But a student can't come up and say, well, I had a student loan grant of $100,000, so I don't understand why I have to pay this back. So this is also proof that they understand that they're borrowing money, and that this, and also they have to read the master promissory note, right? So all of this information obligates them to their loans. But occasionally these get missed. This is a common error. So again, if you do this electronically, document it, student loans, .gov, then you should be fine. Let's see. A couple of things too. So different loan programs. We have PLUS programs, and then we have the sub and unsub loans. So PLUS is for graduate students and for parents. That's a separate loan, so they will also have to do an entrance counseling process as well. Okay, so all of these, especially the first-time borrowers, they will need to do that. Now we have some specific things for like first-time freshmen. How long do you have to wait before you disperse that loan? 30 days. You always have to do that? Is there any exception to that rule? Do you remember what it is? You have a low default rate. I don't remember what the number is right off the top of my head, but I'm going to say less than 10? Less than 10%. You don't have to worry about that. So you can argue with the auditor now. But yeah, so I mean, those are some things. But again, the entrance counseling talks about the beginning, right? The exit counseling is on the end. So questions come up about students maybe attending another institution or getting another program. They only need to do this one time too. So once they're within a couple of months at the end of their program or very close, then you send them off this information so they have time to complete it, and then you can chase them down. You don't really have anything you can hold them to here. You can't say, I will withhold your degree if you don't submit your entrance or exit counseling. But the department just needs proof. You know, if your auditor needs proof that you made an attempt to send this to the student and that they got the information, okay? So if the student withdraws, what do? Are you required to do exit counseling if they borrowed money and then they withdrew, say, a year or two later? Yes, you are. How do you do that? Can you go to send them to studentloan.gov? You're probably never going to hear from them again, but you can. But you have to notify them and you have to prove that you've done that. So the auditor needs proof that you sent it. You can also mail them a packet. You can have a letter and you can send them some documentation that shows them where to get to this information online. So they have the I promise to repay my loans speech. So the easiest group to overlook are probably the withdrawals. How long do you have to complete exit counseling? Do you remember? Does anyone remember? 30 days. 30 days from the date they are departing. So I told you to do it a couple months early. That will save you. Okay, don't wait till the last minute. Do any of you do it in person entrance or exit counseling? Okay, so that's good. So that's another way to make sure you catch everyone. I also have a note here that completed loan counseling can be viewed on COD. Okay. I don't have a lot of access to information in COD anymore. That was the good old days. Question?
What happened to the student who doesn't do it, that is exit counseling? What happened to his fines? What are the consequences?
So if the student doesn't do entrance or exit counseling, that's okay. You just have to document that you submitted the information to them. I would try multiple attempts. I would email them, maybe a postal address. For international students, of course, it'll be more difficult. They probably are not going to have the same home address if they left or withdrew. But send proof that, show proof that you've done it electronically. Also, if you can send mail, a physical mail, and maybe to their home address on the FSA, on the student aid report, the ICER, that would be another way I would suggest to do that. There is no consequence for the student not to do exit counseling. It's more of a cover your bases that the department is, or federal student aid is talking about your rights and responsibilities once you finish school. But a lot of them are interested in this though, because they need to understand their loan payment terms, the grace period, whether or not what happens if they re-enroll in school somewhere else. If they're enrolled at least half-time in a degree-seeking program, they can defer their loans. So there's a couple of different situations where this comes into play. So usually they're eager to learn about this. And as you heard this morning, the secretary talking about 10 different options for loan repayment terms, it can be confusing for them. So they may need some guidance on that too. And you may or may not be able to help them completely, but you can at least direct them to where they can read information. And of course, this is studentloan.gov, right? Their servicer will also help them with this as well. Servicer is the person who collects the money once they get the loans into repayment. So, and for example, if they've already used their grace period and they've finished school, their repayment begins immediately, right? So it's coming due. So hopefully a lot of them will be interested in this. They'll want to go through the exit counseling so they understand what's coming next, especially if they've borrowed a significant amount of money or they want to attend another school to get another degree. Credit balances. How long do you have to release credit balances to students? 14 days. So of course we're finding problems with this as well. Who releases credit balances? Do you do that? No, it's the business office, right? Or whoever you call them. Okay, the equivalent of the business office, student accounts. So you have to have a relationship with your business office. And so, I think this is a theme we've talked about a little bit throughout the last couple days. Is there's a partnership with your business office, your financial aid office, and the student registrar, the academic advisors, and something is running around here. And so you need to have a partnership with these folks so they understand things like when credit balances need to be cut, when refund checks are due, how, when they have to disperse money into your account. How many days do you have once the money comes in? Do you know how many days? How many days do you have to disperse the money that's drawn down? 3 days. So they need to know that information, okay? So this is all part of the partnership, and you thought financial aid was just your responsibility. So there's a lot of people involved in this process, especially for the new folks. So you need to make sure that everybody's on board and they understand that there's multiple people that need to be key players in this situation. So again, another issue is there's no process to determine when it's been created. When is the credit balance starting? And so again, you need to work with your business office so they understand the 3-day rule and the 14-day rule, so they can start cutting these checks. And let's see, a non-compliant authorization. So I have a few pieces of information to discuss about what you need in your authorization. So it has to explain what FSA funds are covered in the document and specify the time period covered. It must clearly provide the student or parent with the information he or she needs to make an informed decision. And the student or parent must be informed that he or she may refuse to authorize any individual item, that he or she may cancel such an authorization at any time, and that a cancellation is not retroactive. And a credit balance authorization must provide detail that is sufficient to give the student or parent an idea of how the credit balance will be used. So this means, are we going to cut them a check, or are we going to leave it in their account? So some students may do that. I don't know if that's your experience. They probably want the money, right? Yeah. So occasionally, if you have an on-campus housing setup, they may, all of their money may go to your tuition or fees and housing, but usually they'll want money for books or some other, spending money, depending on how they do that. So you have to obtain the authorization from a student or parent borrower before your school can hold the credit balance. So when should you do this? When should you start sending these out? Right away, right? Because the money's coming. So make sure you have this in your checklist. So a couple of new points, right? Schools that are on heightened cash monitoring and reimbursement payment methods must credit the student's account ledger or student's ledger before the amount of Title IV funds for the student or the parent is eligible to receive. They have to pay that first, okay? So as a result of that, they can't do this. So because they have to pay their credit balance, they cannot hold the money for 14 days. They got to cut it. Okay, you can't leave it in their account. There's no, I think I've confused you. You have to cut the check. You can't leave the money in the student's account. You can't hold it at the end of the year. You've got to cut it loose, and you can't hold it at the end of the payment period. So these are some issues that we're finding that are consistently problematic. Any questions on that? I'm sorry.
So we transfer the money to the students to their credit balance, but by bank transfer. And if they haven't provided their bank details, how long, we can have on record, how long do you have that?
The question is if they haven't provided you the bank details, then you got to find another method to pay them the refund within the allotted time frame. It can even be cash. You can get the old. What country are you from? It might be sterling. You might be sending them some sterling. So optimally, they would get you the bank accounts before that. I don't know. Is this a common issue where they're getting their bank accounts set up when they get? It takes them a while to get them set up when they get overseas. So you're saying a check? You cut them a check? Is that what you said? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So again, this means a partnership with your business office. You may need to give them a check or cash if you can't get the refund sent to their bank account, or sometimes they even load them now on debit cards. There's all sorts of different ways to do it. Question?
No, just that we've also transferred it into the US bank accounts if they didn't have UK ones.
Oh, okay. The transfer to US bank accounts. There may be some additional fees involved if you do that, so just be aware of that. Question?
Do you have to have the authorization in place if you're returning the funds within 14 days?
I would assume you would need this before the money's even dispersed, right? So yeah. Other questions? Okay. So this one is kind of broad. It's just called repeat findings. So this is, you had a problem last year and we sent you some information that identified the problem, and you were required to complete something called a corrective action plan. We call them CAPS for short. We have acronyms for everything. And in this situation, the CAP didn't remedy the problem. So you get a repeat finding. Or if the CAP was ineffective for previous years, or you didn't have sufficient internal controls, there's a lot of reasons why these happen. But the problem is when you start having repeat findings, bad things can happen. Okay, so then we can start heightened cash monitoring issues, letters of credit. There's all sorts of things that can come out of this that we want to avoid. So if you have a situation where you created a corrective action plan, the corrective action plan identifies the problem and how you're going to solve it, and this has to be in your compliance audit. Okay, so you have to create this, and you have to create the process, the policy. Maybe you have to adjust it or adapt it. But if you don't remedy that, and this is a repeat finding over and over again, like if the students are, if you're still missing entrance counseling, then there's a problem, right? So you have to close the gap in how your process works. There's something missing. So again, this is a common. It's not common. I shouldn't say that. It's not common, but if it becomes common, then it's a problem, right? That means that there's an internal control that's broken somewhere, and it may not be with you, right? 14 days doesn't. It's not the financial aid administrator's situation. That's the bursar, the student accounting office. That could be their issue. So that's where again the partnership comes together. You may need to have a conversation with them so that they understand what needs to happen and when. Okay, so the next one is the incorrect calculation of the EFC or the COA. That didn't all fit on the top, so I had to abbreviate a little bit. If you would like to get more information about the calculation of these, you should go to Volume 3, Chapter 2 of what? The Federal Student Aid Handbook, yes, because that's where I'm going to go to look for it when you ask me this question. And so there's a couple of issues that are surrounding this. One is the failure to properly review your ICER or SAR. For those of you that are new, these are the output documents when a student completes their financial aid application. It's called the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. They fill that out, they send it up to a processing center, and then they have an output document. It's called a student aid report or an institutional information student record. Thank you. So we call them ICERs because it's easier to say. So you'll have one or the other, a student aid report or the ICER. But again, incorrect calculations of the EFCs can be things like sometimes their taxes paid may be the same as their income. That would make a 0 EFC occasionally. That usually flags, but there could be situations like that. Remember the allowable costs in your cost of attendance, and we try to work with schools on this because we're finding some issues, but you have tuition and fees, books and supplies, room and board, transportation, and personal expenses, and then the one that always gets you is loan fees. Okay, so you can include loan fees for students that borrow. You can use averages or you can use actuals. That's a big one. Okay, so if you don't include that, then the student could have borrowed more money, for example, or we're talking small amounts, but these all have impacts in what students can borrow. Also, if they're half-time or less than half-time, there's different budget changes for that, especially if they're less than half-time. when you're filling out when you have the student aid report, the EFC, do you know how many months that's usually for? 9 months, right? So if a student goes for one term and you've packaged them for a year, what happens? The EFC is different, right? You got to use a 4-month EFC. So that's another issue. So sometimes you have to go back when you're making changes. If a student only goes half the year, then they're only going to get, you're going to split their aid up, but their contribution number changes, which could impact their eligibility. So their need can change. So the overarching financial aid formula is the cost of attendance minus the expected family contribution equals what I call the need, or the EFA, estimated family, amount, but it's the need. It's what's left, right? So you can borrow the difference in need-based aid. But that's the formula. COA minus EFC equals their financial need. So if you're not doing these correctly, if their EFC is not correct, or they put wrong information on their student aid report, and we'll talk a little bit about conflicting information, but those all have to be addressed. Also, budget issues. So you may have a different budget for your on-campus students versus your off-campus students. So you need to make sure that those are correctly coded. Occasionally you'll have students that switch somewhere. You may have to do some sort of blending of that, but the budget amounts may be different. Here in the US, we usually have 3. We have an on-campus budget, an off-campus budget, and a living with parents. It's probably less common with you that you'll have a student living with parents, but they would not have the same expenses that a school would, or a student would have that is, traveling overseas, right, on their own. So, so you have to make some adjustments for that. Let's see, I just had another thought that left my mind. It'll come back to me. Any questions on that? Yes?
You mentioned the origination fees must be included. Do we give them the option to include that in this COA?
I didn't hear the last part.
Can we give them the option to include the origination fees, or they've got to be included?
No, you should include the option. You should include the loan fees. It's part of the cost of attendance. You can use an actual or an estimated amount. It would be different, probably significantly different for graduate students than undergrads. And remember, depending on the undergraduate, their loan limits change as their first year, second, and third and fourth.
But can they choose to borrow the origination fees on top of the plus loan if they want it, but they don't want to borrow the extra?
Yeah, they can. It gets fun calculating that too. But yeah, they can borrow the loan fee amounts. They don't have to though. No, it's not a requirement. It's up to them. Yeah, it just has to be an option. So they'll see that when you create your cost of attendance, but it's not a requirement for them to take that money out. But it needs to be in their COA. Other questions on that? Disbursement notifications. So in general, there are 2 types of notifications that a school has to provide. There has to be a general notification to the parent loan borrowers who have taken out a PLUS loan, and also the student loan borrowers when there is money credited to their account. And so in this situation, you have to let them know that they have the right to cancel this loan. And you have to do this, you shouldn't be doing it at the time of disbursement, right, or even a little bit before, so that they know that this can change. Because some students may change their mind. I'm sure in your case it's not common, but they may have a change of circumstance. Maybe they won the lottery and they don't need aid this quarter. So, but this should be what I consider part of your disbursement checklist to make sure that they're enrolled, eligible program, not on an online program. So another one is we've got to send them this disbursement notification. And so you let them know how much they're going to expect and what their options are, when the money's going to be dispersed, how it'll be dispersed, what the process is for them. It has to be sent before the disbursement is made. I'm sorry. Question?
Sorry. On emailing students notifying them of the right to cancel, should that occur at each disbursement, or is it just front-ended?
It's a good question. So the question is if when do I have to send these notifications out? And it's before every disbursement because they could cancel any one of them. So
How much time should you give them to cancel?
I don't. That's a good question. The question is how much time should you give them? It has to be before the disbursement, but I don't want to give you. There's no regulation on that, but probably what's reasonable is a few days, a week, or something like that. Yeah. So this is an easy one to overlook, right? So you're running through your everything and then you forget, oh, I got to let them know that they have a disbursement because they're also going to get information from their student loan servicers. So as soon as the disbursement's made, the servicer is going to notify them as well. So it's kind of a double, they'll get one from each organization who's got their loan as well. Question?
Is it a big deal if it's done after the disbursement because of the exchange? When in my disbursement notification, I put the Canadian money, so I'm waiting to see how much they will receive in their student account. So like that, I put the right amount in the disbursement notification. So I always wait the day after they receive the money in their student account.
It needs to be before. So you might have to estimate. So we're estimating this. There could be some adjustments based on currency fluctuations, things like that. Any other questions? Yes.
I send out notification to the students, and let's say I've got a student who says everything's fine, they want the money. The money arrives, and the student says, I decide that you don't want it. What happens in a case like that? They've already told me beforehand that everything's fine.
Okay, I'm sorry, one more time.
I notify the student of how much they should be getting in the next disbursement, and I ask them to confirm that that's what they want. The student sends me confirmation that they want that amount. The money arrives, and then they decide that they want less.
Well, it depends on the question is what happens if a student changes their mind in the middle of the process? Is that kind of the basic question?
No, not in the middle of the process. After the process has been completed and the money's arrived.
Well, they have the right to cancel all or part of that disbursement. So,
Even after the money's arrived?
yeah. And then you just return that back to the lender. So even after the money has arrived, you still can cancel part of that loan. It's a little bit of a headache to deal with the funding side of it, but that is their right. So.
Sorry, but what if the money's gone into their account? Surely they need to contact the loan servicer, don't they?
No, you're the one that's dispersing it. You'll be the one in charge of returning that fund right after it happened.
But the money's gone into their account.
If the money's gone into their account, you got to get it. You got to pull it back. I mean, they shouldn't be taking the money if they want it returned. So, yeah, it's your responsibility at that point. But once they take the refund, then then that's theirs. If they want to pay their lender back, they can do that.
Sorry, can we set up a policy that says that they don't hand over a refund after the student has taken the money? Unless like they drop off
No, what's the date? How many days?
120 days. If you return the money within 120 days, it reverses the loan fees. So it's better. It actually helps the student if you return the money. That way they won't even be charged for interest or loan fees for them.
Get a microphone. We're going to get Carla a microphone. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, enrollment status verification. Does everybody understand what enrollment status is? So I've had this situation happen with one student who actually attended an institution twice, and then only to find out she deferred her she deferred her enrollment and they paid her loans out twice. So you have to really make sure, you have to have a good process in place to make sure that your students are actually enrolled in their programs before you start dispersing aid. And I know there's a fine line for you in this because you want to get this done as quickly as possible because the students are coming, they're expecting money, they're probably, barely making it, right, when that happens. But you need to make sure that they're enrolled. And so this is another issue of coordination. You need to talk to the registrar's office before you do any disbursements. Part of your checklist is make sure that the student's enrolled, okay? And so, again, students change their mind, but this is another consideration about maybe doing your disbursements a little bit later. So in the United States, it's common for schools to do disbursements after what we call the add drop period. So that's basically when the students have, these are more undergrad issues, but when the undergrads are going to change courses or maybe they add drop units, they have usually a week to do that. So I'll leave that up to you, but just be aware sometimes if it works for your system, your process, to make sure that the student has arrived or didn't have a visa issue or something like that, do whatever is prudent for your organization, but just make sure that the student is actually enrolled. And of course, and I know you're good at this, but you want to make sure that they have some money when they get there, because if they're coming to you begging for funds right at the first day, that's going to create some challenges, right? So you can't make exceptions. Sometimes your campus, I don't know if any of you have any short-term loan programs or things like that that you do for some of your students, but all of this is something I would preemptively tell your students on the websites or when you talk with them individually so they know what to expect, that the money isn't just waiting when they get there. Excuse me. And of course, discussing this disbursement timing, again, this is the partnership that I keep mentioning. So, attendance records, of course, this only applies to institutions that take attendance. And that may be some of you. How many of you are attendance taking institutions, or maybe a hybrid where you take attendance for a while? Okay, and then the rest of you don't take attendance. So in this situation, too, we also have, there can be an attendance verification when you have a status check for their immigration. So that's another way you can check attendance if you are dispersing aid. But for most of you, if you're an attendance-taking institution, then you're going to have some sort of electronic record of the student actually being enrolled and sitting in the classes, right? So again, it boils down to the communication issue. You need to make sure that your registrar office is communicating with you so you know when you disperse the aid, the student is actually enrolled and that they've started their program and haven't withdrawn at some point. So administrative capability, this is sort of a big topic, and it falls into every aspect of what a financial aid administrator does. And so a lot of time we just lump a situation. If we don't have a specific issue, we just say, well, we have a lack of administrative capability. And that's not a mean term. It just means that there may be some internal controls that are not appropriate, or you're missing, you have inadequate policies, or you haven't been to training, or you have new folks, or the business office arguing with you when they're going to give you refunds, those kinds of things. That never happens, right? They don't ever argue. No. So administrative capability can be a finding from your auditor as well. And so, again, it sounds harsh, but it's just usually an internal control issue, or it could be multiple issues. Right? There could be multiple findings that that leads the auditors to question your capability of actually administering the program. And that makes us look into that a little bit deeper, right? So that can lead to things like heightened cash monitoring or letters of credit, or both. Sometimes depends on the situation. So in general, the compliance audits, I think we're getting better at this, and as we move into electronic processing, shortly in the future, I don't know exactly when, but some of this will resolve itself. But there are usually a few pieces of the puzzle, and I've talked to my supervisor who used to handle all the foreign school audits, and now he's working on our eligibility team. But a lot of this kind of simply boils down to the auditor needs to make sure that they are following the audit guide to the letter. And so I've seen some things that are rejected just because they're missing a couple of paragraphs, right? So you have to really, really make sure, and you're responsible for this too, make sure that they're following the audit guide, because what's happening is we have a group of contractors that are taking the documents in, so we don't see that. That's not part of our daily routine. So we have another group of people working this process through, and then all of a sudden, you get a letter in the mail that says something has been rejected. And so, but the big thing, how many of you have ever had a corrective action plan before, right? Right, so they work well, they're very common. We all make mistakes, we all miss issues, and so the corrective action plan is the opportunity to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. It helps tighten your internal controls. Question?
Yeah, I had my audit rejected this year because I didn't have a corrective action plan. I had no findings, but I was told I need to have a corrective action plan that
Yes.
says I have no corrective action plan.
Yes, yeah, yes.
That's correct, yeah.
Yes. So yes, so that's one problem. If you need to comment on prior year findings, and currently if you have no findings from the prior, you need to comment and say we had no prior year findings, so they'll reject the audit. So I just work in eligibility. That's not a rule I made up, but that's what I mean. Following the audit guide, it's in the audit guide. If you go look, it's in the audit guide. And so, and that's actually on your auditor, okay? You guys need to have a conversation about that, but and I don't know, we have met, I know there's a couple auditors, I don't know if they're in the room, but you need to make sure you have a really good auditor. This is really important. It's good to find somebody that's experienced, and if you're not having a good experience, then you need to get rid of them. So this is really critical and important information. Your auditors should all be here in this room learning the same information that you are, because they're responsible for this information too. Question?
Talking about corrective action plans, it's really good to have them, but
Can you guys get microphones for these things? Go ahead.
2 weeks ago we just got our audit determination for 2014. So whilst we're submitting corrective action plans, we don't actually know if they're sufficient until we've done 2 compliance audits since then. So
Say that again at the end.
Our final audit determination letter,
Yeah.
2014.
We call that a FATL, by the way.
Yeah, what do you call it?
FATL.
Our FATL.
Final audit determination.
Determination
And a
letter.
PATL is the preliminary.
Showed up in my office 2 weeks ago from 2014.
Yeah.
So we've submitted a corrective action plan, but we don't actually get any feedback on if that's sufficient or not. And we've already, until 3 years later, it's just a little bit. A
Yeah.
little bit.
Well, and we're working on getting caught up. We have some, of course, what you mentioned, we have some old audits, and we're dusting those off. We're getting them finished up.
So for the 2015 and 2016
I know.
corrective action plans, if they're insufficient, we don't have enough notice.
Are you under recertification?
No, we just went through it.
That's what happened. When you're under recertification, what happened is that PPA will not be issued until your audits are issued. So we rush to make sure that your audits are complete.
Oh, no, we got our PPA middle of last
Yeah.
year.
No, I mean, I think
no,
your question is.
literally 2 weeks ago we got the letter for 2014. I'm just saying we're submitting corrective action plans, and we don't actually know if they're the correct approach because we're not getting your feedback until 3 years later.
Right. Well, and that would come back the next year, right? So
Well,
that's the
hopefully
problem.
I'll get 2015
There's a bit of a
next year,
delay.
yeah.
And since you're talking about an audit that's a few years old and you've already completed multiple audits after that, it's sort of a moot point. So, I'm sure you've corrected it, because if you didn't, you would have gotten a
Repeat findings.
repeat finding. Yeah. So of course, the best way to do that is what you're doing today. It's learning Title IV administration and getting to talk with your colleagues so you can share stories, best practices, and one thing I'm always wary of is auditors that never find anything. That's usually actually a red flag to me. I mean, it does happen, and I've seen it consistently in some foreign schools, but that is not common in the domestic schools. Usually they find something, right? So if you're always getting perfect audits and then we come around and recertify you and we start tearing things up, that means your auditor's not very good. Like, they should know the policies as well. They should know SAP, R2, T4. They should be able to understand that, and not a lot of them do. Question?
Talking about the exit counselling, did I hear you say that if the cohort default rate was less than 10%, we don't have to conduct the exit counselling?
No, they need to do exit counseling. It actually deals with disbursement of aid. So you can disperse aid 10 days prior to the first day of class. I know maybe I've confused you now, maybe I've confused myself, but yeah, so thank you. So first year, first time borrowers, which in most cases it would be a freshman undergraduate, you cannot disperse their loan until 30 days after the first day of class. And this has only been in, I don't know how many years it's been, maybe the last, I don't know, I'm going to guess 5 or 10, but this is just a precaution. So for a first-time student, they wouldn't have a disbursement right after they came in and they withdrew. So it's sort of a protection mechanism. Okay, but if your disbursements, if your default rate, which most of you in this room are less than 10%, you don't have to hold it for 30 days. Does that make sense? Thank you for reminding me of that. Over here, Carla.
I'm just wondering, does the department offer any sort of foreign schools training boot camp for new administrators? I mean, we struggle to keep up with everything, but one of the challenges I know is because there's so few of us in the countries that we work in, that if your administrator leaves, you document and you do what you can. But is there some type of program that is offered by you for new administrators just to get the basic boot camp?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. I'll let Carla answer one of them because I think she knows where I'm going with this. But on the back end, it's important that your transition for new administrators, unless somebody leaves abruptly, right? This is why you need correct policies and procedures, because it should be a seamless handoff. In a perfect world, it's not always the case, right? And so, no, we don't have anything specific for initial new financial aid administrator training other than what we have here this week. And that's part of the process, so we want to help you get started. But there is an onboarding process when you first begin the program. But if you're just an administrator that's changing gears, you're taking over for somebody that left, the first thing I would say is that they need to hit IFAP, the Information for Financial Aid Professionals, ifap.ed.gov. That's the main page where everything is. It can be a little bit daunting because there's a lot of information, but we have online training, so there's assessments and the FSA coach. I'm trying to find here, what else? And also here, so a couple of things. So we have a web page. If you go into IFAP, there's a link to the foreign schools page, but this is a foreign school handbook. This is part 2. So this is the first thing I would read if I was a new administrator, is the foreign school handbook. And then in here, Carla, last year when we updated it, put what we call a crosswalk in here. And so the crosswalk, you can't see this, but the crosswalk basically shows you which chapters in the federal student aid handbook that you should go and that are applicable to foreign schools. Because not all of them are, right? You don't handle grants, things like that. and some of the information may not apply. So those are the first two things. And then the online assessments. There's a brand new SAP assessment online that Virginia Hagen's just did, and it's actually an audio recording. And so you can access those things, but maybe Carla, you might talk a little bit about what an IIS might do for a new financial aid administrator.
What we do is for all new schools, but it's for all new schools, I now do a new school visit. A new school visit is I go through your system, I audit your flow, I check if your policy is correct, disclosures is correct, and then your onboarding is correct. Oh, and then I help you. It's reaching out to new schools. So when my new schools are done, I also reach out to those schools that have multiple findings in their audit. I reach out to them, I look at their audits, I look at what their deficiency is, if their policies are not correct. So if you have any questions, you can email me and I'll try to answer and guide you on anything that you might need clarification. Did I open myself up there?
Nope, you're good. We're going to move on, actually, because I don't want anybody to ask Carla any more questions on that. But that's a start for you, okay? But I just want to move on just a little bit, because we just have a few more minutes, talk a little bit about audit rejection letters, because I know some of you have received these. We call them a standard incomplete letter, but it talks about what's missing or rejected. It's not always very helpful, but usually there's going to be a box or two checked that say, something is missing. For example, the corrective action plan that you didn't have last year because you didn't have any findings. But it can be multiple things in there, and this is your responsibility to work with your auditor to get this resolved, okay? We always refer schools back to the Foreign School Audit Guide, and like I say, sometimes it's simple things that are left out when you're going through the process. So, as I've already mentioned before, the auditor is very important, so make sure you hire somebody that has good Title IV experience and has multiple years and worked with other schools. They follow the guide exactly. Okay, we don't input this data personally, but the ones that do, and those of you who have dealt with this, know that they're very specific in what they're asking for. Hang on a second. Jane will be first up here. Make sure you submit your compliance audit on time. It's 6 months after the end of your fiscal year date. Okay, and you have to, when you're a new school, you got to make sure you get a compliance and engagement letter so you can get this started and build a relationship, because you're going to have to do this every single year, and they do cost money, so it's not cheap. And then make sure you're filling out the correct audit, whether you're doing a standard audit or an alternative. Again, this is going to change based on the new audit information that we heard yesterday, but right now it's the 500,000 mark, above or below. So don't do a standard audit when you can do an alternative one. It's actually easier and less information. So a couple of things that you may overlook. So the institutions, the compliance audit has to be on institutional letterhead and signed by your president, chief executive officer, or vice chancellor. And it has to include the corrective action plans. And as you have we already discussed, if you didn't have a corrective action plan for last year, you have to note that. Okay, if you didn't have any findings for the prior year. The audit piece for the auditor has to be on their letterhead, so I don't know, there's multiple audits. I'm confusing you, right? Because I just said those things. So the actual audit the auditor is going to have an opinion, right? They're going to list this, and it's got to be on their letterhead. It has to be signed and dated by them. I've had that issue before as well. And they have to comment on prior year findings. That's a common error that they miss, and that's in the audit guide too. And so these are the resources that you can use to educate yourself as well as the auditor on where to find more information. 34 CFR. CFR is another buzzword. It's the Code of Federal Regulations, and you can search for this. There's something called the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. You can punch in these numbers 668.16, 668.174. You can review this information. Also, NSLDS. You've heard also today earlier, they talked about the Dear Colleague letters. These are called DCLs. We have our acronyms again. These are all available on the ifap.ed.gov website. And then the NSLDS website as well. And then it goes on and on. So we've got FSA Coach. This goes back to your earlier question about training where you can get more information. FSA Coach has different modules that are on very specific issues. My favorite thing, the FSA handbook. And that's where a lot of this information will be. This is our foreign school webpage. So it's not easy to remember, but if you come back to this link, we'll have these available. I'm not sure exactly when they'll be up, but I would assume in a few weeks they'll have these discussions posted, so you can check out the actual PowerPoints and then link to this webpage. And this is our where we're updating everything frequently, so I would encourage you to bookmark that website. So we have the Federal Student Aid Handbook, the Foreign School Handbook, and the Audit Guide, right? So those are the 3 books that we're talking about today. So, okay, Jane, question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could tell us again when the new foreign school audit guide's coming out?
Yeah, I don't have an answer on that.
Oh.
Soon? We're hoping for next year. So this is another thing out of, yeah, it's out of our.
So it's nothing, I thought it was something new on it.
No, they're working on it now, which is the good part. We didn't hear anything for a long time, but the IG came yesterday and discussed it's in process. So we're hoping soon. So maybe next year, maybe. Question.
So I'm with OIG, and I'm the
Oh,
one
yes, there you are.
working
Thank
on the
you.
foreign school audit guide. There is a draft currently going through review, and it hasn't made it out of OIG yet. So once that happens, then it goes to FSA and then outside entities. So it's got a ways to go, but we're hoping sometime next year. So.
Which we're really excited about. I mean, this will make life easier for all of us, makes the auditors happy because they're a little uncomfortable with things that are multiple years old. But they're working on it. It's going to be great. But you know, everything takes a little extra time. So, question.
Is the management response required for the FSAG audit?
I'm sorry, say one more time.
Management response.
For what?
For the FSAG audit.
FSAG?
Foreign school audit guide.
Is there a management response required?
Right.
Well, there's a corrective action plan, but this, I'm not sure what you mean by management response.
Well, our auditors told us that, well, last year we had to not only do the corrective action plan, but also provide a management response. But this year they told us that the management response is not required for the FSAG.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. We'll have to ask and find out about that. That could be something your auditor just requires, so that they have a document that you've created. I guess, is that part of your corrective action plan, or is that just, what's the
That
management
was
statement?
last year. Required from us last year, but not for the, well, two years
Management
ago.
assertions, I guess, is what it is. So yeah, they do have to comment on that. I don't do audits, so I'm thinking out loud here, but I think it's under management assertions.
So you have a corrective action plan, which kind of summarizes the finding, and then what you as a school are going to do. And then in the finding, sometimes they will summarize what you said as the management response. So it's usually, whatever your corrective action plan is, your formal response, and then your finding is also supposed to have a little kind of snapshot. They agreed, this is what they're going to do, refer to the corrective action plan. So it's not a separate thing.
Oh, we're happy you're here today. Girl over here.
So I might have misunderstood this, but in one of the general sessions this morning, they were talking about in 2018 there being a special audit that they're running for securities of student data? Like, is that just for domestic, or are foreign schools going to be doing that too?
We have a great resource here in the middle of the room.
Okay, so what they were talking about, the securing student information. The department is currently trying to get testing of that into the 2018 compliance supplement, which is for single audits, not foreign school audit guide. Once it makes it into the single audit compliance supplement, we will be adding it to this guide and the domestic guide. So watch for that, but it's not there yet.
Yeah. I think that's just inevitable. I think, data security has become a big talking point, and a big risk. And so mitigating the risk, I think that's coming. So, yeah, good question. One question over here. We're getting Carla her exercise today. She wanted 10,000 steps, so we're getting close.
Hi. Not specific to audits, but at the beginning of the session you mentioned that if a student's in a grace period, they can re-enroll in the grace period as long as they do it before the end of a grace period. Was that right?
Yeah, so if a student
how
came in,
and when, how do they do that?
well, let's just say that a student went, they withdrew, and the clock starts ticking, and then they're in a quarter system, and so there's 3 10-week terms, and they went for the first 10 weeks, and then they withdrew. They took the winter quarter off. Their 3 months is ticking. They can come back in the spring quarter, and then it starts over again. So as long as they re-enroll at least half time in a degree-seeking program or the same thing they were in, then they haven't used their grace period. So anything less than 6 months, they can do it again. But anything 6 months in a day, and they lose it. So it's not common. It's not commonly going to happen, but it would typically happen in a situation where, like a quarter system, something like that. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. But I just want to say thank you for doing your jobs. I know this is hard work, and you have multiple things on your plate to compete with student financial aid and Title IV regulations, and I know they're confusing, and there's a lot of them. So we hope we can help you. If you have some compliance questions for audits, we'll try and help you with those or refer them to the right folks in our area, and we'll work with you on the policies and procedures so we can help your situation, help your schools run smoother. So we'll be down at the, Ask a Fed, thank you, Ask a Fed booth all week, and we hope to see you down there so we can talk about some individual questions for you. Thank you for your attendance today.